let's learn about lichens. Lichens are fungi that have discovered agriculture. They're not plants, although ecologically they function a lot like plants, especially because they have a photosynthesizing component. And they often grow alongside plants, particularly mosses, for the reason that they're adapted to loss of moisture the same way that mosses are. Here's a boulder in Delaware County, and here on this boulder we see some organisms growing. On the outside, most of the peripheral area here is occupied by a moss, a true plant called dicranum. And there in the center is a lichen, a crustose lichen called porphyria. So lichens and mosses are both what's called poikilohydric. That means that they are to moisture the way that, say, reptiles are to temperature. Whatever the environmental moisture is, they're able to tolerate, and when it gets dry, they can dry out without it harming them. They don't have tissues to transport water around, so they have to be able to make do with whatever the current conditions are. And so they tend to grow in places that other organisms can't grow, and we often see mosses and lichens together, even though mosses are plants, lichens are not. They are fungi with a photosynthesizing component. So here's a close-up showing on the left the green leafy moss, and on the right is the lichen, and those little discs that look like eyes, those are aggregates of spore-producing structures. Those are called apothecia. Here's a little cartoon that shows a feature of mosses and lichens. Oh, this is my stone. No, it's not. Get off. Who's going to make me? That's it. I'm coming over. Come on then. You'll be sorry when I get there. You're the one who'll be sorry. They tend to be slow growing. Here are some people studying lichens and mosses. Which person is studying lichens and which person is studying mosses? Oh, I know. The person on the left is studying lichens and the person on the right is studying mosses. I know that because I know these people, and the person on the left is Ray Showman, Ohio's principal lichenologist, and the person on the right is Barb Andreas, Ohio's principal moss biologist or bryologist. So here's a chart that shows the taxonomic placement of lichens, because they are fungi. So if we hear over here in the eukaryotes, we see over here in the eukaryotes that fungi and animals have a recent common ancestor, and you can see that plants have diverged earlier from this phylogeny. So it's true to say that we are more closely related to lichens than plants are. So in order to learn about lichens, we need to learn a little bit about fungi. The study of mycology is the study of fungi. And fungi, basically, they have as a generalization, we would say that fungi are filamentous decomposers. Their bodies consist of very, very thin strands. You know, if you let the strawberries go too long, which is about 5 minutes, you see this cottony, webby material. Those are fungi hyphae. So each individual strand of a fungus is called a hypha, and the collection of hyphae is called the mycelium. So the body of a fungus consists of strands. Sometimes it isn't obvious because they can be packed together kind of tightly. I kind of think of it as how if you cook spaghetti but you don't stir it much, sometimes the strands of spaghetti get stuck together, so it's like a log. That's kind of the way I think of a more elaborate body of a fungus, which doesn't seem filamentous like a mushroom or the cup of a cup fungus. They still are microscopically composed of filaments called hyphae. And we can see that when we look at lichens. So a little bit of an introduction to mycology in general. Again, mycology, the classification is sort of simple, although it's probably been revised since this slide was made. There are 5 major groups of fungi. What are called chytrids. They live in the water. They kind of decompose water organisms. Zygomycetes, which includes bread mold, for example. A lot of molds are zygomycetes. What are called glomeromycetes are an interesting group of fungi that live in association with the roots of plants, forming a very beneficial symbiosis called mycorrhizae, and they help plants absorb critical nutrients. So most plants' roots live in association with friendly fungi. But none of these fungi are particularly conspicuous terrestrial forms that you would see out in the environment. The remaining 2 are, though. The remaining two are what are called ascomycetes, which are sometimes called sac fungi. The name comes from a structure called an ascus within which the spores are produced. And basidiomycetes, which are sometimes called club fungi. For the same reason, there's a structure called a basidium from which the spores are produced. And most of the fungi you're familiar with in the woods and fields are basidiomycetes, mushrooms and toadstools. Most lichens, however, are ascomycetes. So let's learn about ascomycetes. Ascomycetes are sometimes called sac fungi, and that's because the spores are formed within structures that are called asci. And these spores are actually sexual reproduction, and ascomycetes includes most yeasts. Yeasts is a sort of a general term for unicellular fungi, and many other ascomycetes are more elaborate. They form cups, or morels, the delicious fungi that people hunt for in the spring, are ascomycetes. Most importantly, for our purposes, is that most lichens, which are a partnership between a photosynthesizing organism, usually an alga, but sometimes a bacterium, and fungi, almost always a ascomycete, but sometimes a basidiomycete. So here's a picture of an ascomycete. It's not a lichen, but it shows you what this phylum of fungi is typically like. These are cups, brilliant cups, lined with microscopic sacs called asci. So here's an electron microscope view, not mine, that shows two such asci. So these would be microscopic. And each one of these happens to contain the typical number of spores, which is 8. It's not always 8, but it usually is. And these are packed together to form a layer on the top of some structure that looks typically like a cup. The types of fungi that ascomycetes include, in addition to lichens, as mentioned, the beautiful, delicious morels, the delicious truffles, a lot of those cups like we just saw, and some plant diseases like Dutch elm disease and chestnut blight. So here's a cross-section drawing showing one of those cups, like that brilliant scarlet thing we looked at a few slides ago. And in cross-section, we'll see that some of these hyphae are swollen at the tips and develop, they eventually develop into asci, each of which contains spores, and they're dispersed typically somewhat ballistically from the surface of this cup. So this entire thing you would be able to see. It might be the size of a grain of rice, or it might be really large, almost as big as your hand. So here's another diagram. It's a cross-section view showing that layer of the cup. And each one of these tubular things with the black dots in it, the black dots are spores, the tubular things are asci. And each one of them would be called an ascus. Okay. So the structures that produce the asci that are lined with this layer of asci. So in this picture here, it's like a little cup on a pedestal. And we see dozens of asci, and we can make out the spores within. And typically, as mentioned, they're usually 8, not always. If it's an open cup, it's called an apothecium. And sometimes it's sort of closed and flask-shaped with just a little opening at the top, in which case it's called a perithecium. These are basically the same thing, just with a little difference in shape. And in lichens, we can see both, but we'll most often see an apothecium. But if we're interested in keying them out, we'll be directing our attention to different forms, and sometimes we'll see perithecia, in which case you'll only see a little opening, a little dark spot on the top of the lichen, rather than a big cup. So here's a picture of a lichen that in fact has perithecia. This is a crustose lichen, and each one of these little units with the little dark spot, that's the opening of a flask-shaped perithecium. And if one were to take this lichen and make sections with a razor blade and squish it under a cover slip through a microscope, one would see asci. So this here is an individual ascus with 8 spores in it, packed in there. This is sexual reproduction in a lichen. Some lichens reproduce asexually by just budding. Those are called conidia. It's not a term we use very often in lichenology, but the concept is that many fungi fragment and reproduce asexually. And lichens do it too, but with a slightly different structure. Yeasts, by the way, is a general term for fungi that are unicellular. And most yeasts, including the ones that are of interest commercially, like bread yeast or brewer's yeast, are ascomycetes. There are also basidiomycete yeasts, because the word is a very general term, meaning a unicellular fungus. So here's a nice picture of not a lichen, but just to give us a sense of what ascomycetes are like. This is a fungus that occurs in the spring called the devil's urn, and at the right time of the day and of the year, you can see spores being puffed out of this big apothecium, kind of looking like smoke. It's kind of dramatic. And here's a cross-section of a microscopic view of the top layer of the inside of that particular, I think, devil's urn fungus, showing asci with each of them with 8 spores. Okay, Basidiomycetes. Even though not very many lichens are basidiomycetes, as botanists, we're interested in fungi in general, the ones that are dominant in the ecosystem. So let's just get a sense of what basidiomycetes are. Basidiomycetes are the most conspicuous and important terrestrial fungi and they're called club fungi because instead of producing their spores inside a sac-like structure or any kind of structure, they actually kind of bleb off. Is that a word? I think it is. Bleb off 4 what are called basidiospores. So here's a typical basidiomycete. It's a little mushroom. It's growing on the bark of a tree with, by the way, a moss, this little orthotrichum, and a lichen, this little Candelariella. So here's a picture, electron microscope view, not my picture, that shows one of these clubs. So this is like a club. It's a blunt structure, and the spores are produced on the outside of it. And these are called basidia. And these are the characteristic sexual spore-producing structure of basidiomycetes. Here's a textbook picture of a mushroom where the gills of the mushroom are walls of tissue that are covered on the outside with basidia, these little clubs that bleb off 4 spores. So let's now direct our attention to lichens. And here's a little limerick from a book called How to Tell the Birds from the Flowers. And it compares birds with various types of plants, including lichens, which aren't plants. Lichens, regardless of conventions, exist in only 2 dimensions, a life restricted to a plane, on rocks and stones a greenish stain. They live upon the simplest fare, a drop of dew, a breath of air. Contrast them with the greedy hen, and her most careless regimen. She shuns the barren stones and rocks, and thrives upon the garbage box. Kind of cute. I want to point out that this lichen picture looks so much like the lichen sketch, but I didn't do any photoshopping. I'd never Photoshop a lichen. That would just be wrong. What? Is this a lichen with flowers? No, it's not. This is a lichen, this leaf-like lichen that's growing on the stem of a branch of a redbud tree. And redbud trees often produce a lot of flowers right on the bark. So this is no. And plus, I would never Photoshop a lichen. That would be completely wrong. So let's take a little field trip with a prominent lichenologist named James Lendemer to a cranberry bog in New Jersey. Field trip.